Well, we're going to shift our attention this morning, and we had a wonderful session last night with Colin. He talked about his experiences in India, and mostly from a micro enterprise, small business viewpoint, although he got into a wide range of issues. We're going to shift our attention to big business this morning and supply chain and some other kinds of issues. And I want to set this up, and before I introduce our moderator, who will then introduce the guests, I want to read this quote from Judith Samuelson. This appeared in the fall issue of the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And she said this: "People don't trust real business anymore. They've been whipsawed by sharp reductions in savings, home values, and access to credit, and the rounds of corporate belt-tightening and layoffs that followed. Add a seemingly bottomless pit of Wall Street greed, a massive oil spill, and businesses that seem tone-deaf to the long-term consequences of their products or investments, and you have a toxic soup of deep cynicism and anger at business. But here's the thing. Global business is the most capable agent we have to solve important problems." So we're going to consider that this morning. And at this point, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Randy Franz, Associate Professor of Management here at SPU, and he will moderate our session and introduce our guests. So Randy, come on up, and glad to get going.
Thank you, John. Good to be here. We do have a great session. I just got to meet the speakers here, and I'm looking forward to that. A few comments kind of to frame things, though. And first of all, I'd be very remiss, and they didn't ask me to do this. They don't know I'm going to do this. But if you open your program and the first three signatures that you see on that front page, these are three gentlemen that have put in countless hours into organizing this event. John Terrell being one of them, Jeff Keenan, and Kenman Wong. Let's give them a really thoughtful, warm thank you, for this is an amazing event. John talked about, and hopefully our time last night, and Colin's stories. What an amazing, inspirational figure that was. And hopefully you were here to be able to hear that. I went home, and a lot of those his stories were echoing in my head. In fact, I woke up this morning thinking about one of the numbers that he just kind of underplayed and threw out there. So he was talking about the scale of the problem and the hundreds of millions of people in that kind of productive pool that he's talking about, and that his efforts had only been able to deal with about 7 million of them. And he just kind of blazed right over that. This number, 7 million, kind of stuck in my brain. In fact, it was stuck so much that I woke up real early and had to get up and do some math. And I thought, 7 million, how do you get your hands around that? I mean, that's just an amazing amount. I thought, well, what's the population of the state of Washington? So I Googled state populations. Turns out Washington, 6.7 million people. That's more than all the people in this entire state. In fact, it's more than 38 states' populations. There's only 12 states with more than 7 million people in this country. Talk about scale. This idea of being able to impact the world. It's still a whole state. It was hard for me to get my hands around that. And so I thought, well, how many stadiums would that be? If you want to put all those people, kind of get them together, how many stadiums? If there's about 50,000 people in a stadium on average, there's 30 professional baseball teams. They take all of their stadiums, all 32 of the professional football stadiums, all 30 of the professional basketball arenas, and you'd still need another 50 college stadiums like Husky Stadium to put 7 million people in and get them together in one place. Talk about an amazing impact on the world. Colin, you're doing amazing stuff, and it just boggles my mind. But still, that's only a drop in the bucket when you're talking about 7 billion people and 300 million of them living under $10 a month in India. The scale of these problems are amazing. So we turn our attention from small and micro enterprise to large global companies. Today we have, and this morning now, we're going to learn about two large publicly traded for-profit companies trying to intentionally and positively impact the world in terms of jobs, poverty, social, and environmental issues through their supply chains. So if you're not a business person, you're the supply chain, what is that? So I took the liberty of going to, again, checking up and finding a definition for us. And here's what businessdictionary.com says about supply chain. And there's a million different definitions. But I like this one. It says it's the entire network of entities, directly or indirectly interlinked and interdependent in serving the same customer. It comprises of vendors that supply raw materials, producers who convert that material into products, warehouses that store, and distribution centers that deliver to the retailers, and the retailers who then bring the product to the ultimate users. And that's only a short list of all the players. I guess one of the ways I like to think about supply chain is, if you imagine a giant global company as kind of a mighty river. Think of the Columbia River or the Mississippi River, and you go down to where it enters the ocean. You've got this huge amount of water coming through there. But where does all that water come from? It's just this incredible network of tributaries and streams and others that flood into this. You have all this water catchment area, and the entire space that gets consumed and kind of contributing to that. That's a sense of all the contributing parts and pieces that come into the flow of products that we see in the stores at these global companies. That gives a little bit of a vision of kind of the scope of the idea of supply chain. And so supply chain is really important. Somebody who got the idea of supply chain 50 years ago, I have a kind of a little quote here, and this is parallel. John quoted from JFK last night. I'm going to quote from MLK this morning, and I credit Jeff Keenan with giving me this quote, but Martin Luther King Jr. Preached a sermon on Luke 12, which if you're not familiar with that, and I had to look it up, it's the story about the greedy farmer or the foolish farmer, the guy who had such a great harvest and was so successful that his barns couldn't hold everything. So he says, what am I going to do? I know, I'll rip them down, I'll build bigger barns. And then I'll say to myself, hey, I can sit back and retire and I'm going to be great from this point on. Well, of course, and this point of the story is that God comes to him that night and says, fool, tonight you're going to die. You can't take it all with you. Then what's going to happen? So Martin Luther King, commenting on that passage, says, the rich man was a fool because he failed to realize his dependence on others. He talked as though he could plow the fields and build the barns alone. He failed to realize that he was an heir of a vast treasury of ideas and labor to which both the living and the dead had contributed. When an individual or a nation overlooks this interdependence, we find a tragic foolishness. All of this tells us something basic about the interdependence of people and nations. Whether we realize it or not, each of us is eternally in the red. We are everlasting debtors to known and unknown men and women. We do not finish breakfast without being dependent on more than half of the world. When we arise in the morning, we go to the bathroom where we reach for a sponge which is provided for us by a Pacific Islander. We reach for soap that is created for us by a Frenchman. The towel is provided by a Turk. And then at the table, we drink coffee, which is provided for us by a South American, or tea by a Chinese, or cocoa by a West African. Before we leave for our jobs, we're beholding to more than half the world. In a real sense, all life is interrelated, he says. All people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. And here's where you can kind of hear Martin Luther King's eloquence coming out. He says, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. That was 50 years ago. And while the references might be a little dated, think about all the clothes that you're wearing today. Where did they come from? Who made them? Who grew the material? Who mined it? Let alone what you ate, what we were partaking from over here. We are literally what we eat. The companies that create things are the network of suppliers and hands that touch them. Supply chain matters. Two kind of quick examples of the power of supply chain before I introduce our speakers who are insiders to this whole world. Recently, obviously, the devastation in Japan. the earthquake, tsunami, the nuclear meltdown, and all this, some things, humanitarian crisis happening there right now. But just this week, I picked up an interesting article on CNN Money talking about the impact that the shutdown over there is going to have here. And that in the coming couple weeks, we're probably going to start to feel the shortage of parts, whether it's the car manufacturers directly, but think about the kind of things that get manufactured in Japan. These are not your low-end, easy to replicate kinds of things. This is typically the most technical, most sophisticated, most proprietary parts that go into many of the products that we consume. And their economy is still pretty much shut down. And that's going to ripple now through the rest of the global economy. And so they're talking about all kinds of slowdowns here and elsewhere. So the effect, the interconnectedness from a horrible problem over there is really going to come home here very soon. And the power, though, of supply chains. It's interesting to me to think a little bit about Walmart and their recent initiative in terms of packaging and changing the packaging. And when a company of the scale of Walmart decides to do something, it has incredible leverage because all of the suppliers, all the people that go into that, and let's face it, we have kind of a packaging problem in this country. Think about the things you buy and the number of layers of packaging that go into those things. If we can be more efficient with that, we can have incredible consequences for environmental footprints and other kinds of things. So one company choosing to make decisions and echoes up and down their supply chains. So the huge leverage, the huge impact, the sense of interconnectedness. The point is supply chains matter. And that's really my setup to our two speakers today. We have the privilege of hearing from two insiders. I'm going to read their bios and introductions now, and then we'll call them up here. And the format will be, they'll have some time to kind of give you a bit more of their background and what's going on. And I've got a few questions to kind of set them up and get the conversation going. But we'll have plenty of time for you to ask your own questions as well. So our first contestant, our first panelist today is Bonnie Nixon. And she, until just recently, until the first of this year, she was the Director of Environmental Sustainability at Hewlett-Packard. And as Director of Ethical Sourcing at HP, Bonnie implemented the world's largest and most complex electronic, ethical, and sustainable supply chain program for over 10 years. More than $50 billion went through HP's supply chain. And Bonnie was responsible for building a solid business case and constructively engaging thousands of global suppliers on environmental, health, safety, ethical, and labor practices. Bonnie knows how to humanize and green supply chains from the field and farms to the tables and stores, and more importantly, from the top floor to the shop floor. Bonnie was a key driver in a common industry code of conduct and complementary tools and processes as the founder and board member of the Electronic Industry Citizen Coalition. She serves on multiple multi-industry consortiums, including global retailers, footwear and apparel, toy, pharmaceutical, chemical, automotive, consumer goods, and mining. Bonnie has been a positive and powerful spokesperson for HP and the corporate sector. Prior to her time at HP, Bonnie owned an environmental planning and communications firm. More recently, Bonnie's been a resident scholar at Stanford University, part of the executive faculty at the Presidio's Sustainability MBA. She was named one of the sustainable industry's 20 leading green executives in 2008. She's also the chairwoman of Sustainable Silicon Valley, a senior fellow with the Future 500, and serves on the board of directors for the Blue Planet Network. Now, if that weren't enough, just recently, in fact, this week, it has now been announced that Bonnie will become the executive director of the Sustainability Consortium. If you haven't heard of that, that's an interesting new partnership between educational and industry groups. This is Arizona State University and the University of Arkansas are the two primary educational institutions, and then it's sponsored by a variety, dozens of giant local companies have come together, and they're trying to figure out how to do life cycle analysis, basically understand the impacts of products for all different sectors of the economy. So it's a very strategic, new, interesting position for her. So congratulations, Bonnie, on that. We look forward to great things there. So that's Bonnie Nixon. You'll get to hear from her in just a second. But first, we're going to hear from Gregg Nebel. He is the Adidas Group Head of Social and Environmental Affairs for the Americas and a founding network of the Social and Environmental Affairs Department. If you don't recognize Adidas, that's the German way of saying Adidas. It's a global company. I kind of grew up in Germany for a while, so I had to say that. But he directs the regional field operations and compliance activities with the group's footwear, apparel, and accessories supply chain. He's the social and environmental affairs point person for all the group's brands. That includes Adidas North America, Reebok, TaylorMade, Rockport, CCM, and Ashworth, and their subsidiaries and licensees, so a bunch of people. So his global management responsibilities include strategic compliance planning, methodology development, compliance performance measurement, stakeholder verification processes, and public reporting. And maybe we'll have to ask him to unpack what that really means. He's represented the Adidas Group as the director of the Fair Labor Association Board since 2003 and the executive board since 2011. He sits on the board of the Fair Factories Clearinghouse, an organization dedicated to the enhancement of ethical sourcing practices. He's been with Adidas since 1993 and served 5 years as their America's head of apparel sourcing. And he spent 30 years working for the fashion and athletic brands and their apparel and footwear supply chains in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. He holds a political science degree from Providence College and then studied in Europe, in Switzerland, and he speaks French, Spanish, and Portuguese, besides English. And he makes his home here in Poulsbo, Washington. So help me welcome our two panelists as they come forward and take their seats. All right, we'll hear first from Gregg, and he'll tell us a little bit about his position and background, and then we'll turn it over to Bonnie.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. This morning at 6:15, as I was sitting on the ferry coming over here, I had a chance to reflect on several things from last night that the speakers were talking about, but more importantly, as somebody who flies 170,000 miles a year, and I'm traveling 240 days a year, and I'm in 15 or 18 countries a year. I was really able to meditate and to be inspired by the beauty of this place where we live. I mean, it's just an awesome place. And I know people talk about the rain and the gloom, but I kind of like that. And when you're looking at the dawn in the Pacific Northwest across the Puget Sound, it's quite beautiful. If I can just talk a couple of seconds about the things that I heard last night that inspired me and made me think. Jeff Van Duzer mentioned something about the mission of the business school here, which is to influence the students going through the business school in a way that they will be different as business people. And I started thinking back when I graduated from university back in the middle 1970s, corporate responsibility was not a phrase. There were two separate words. And I thought, okay, what's been driving me for all of this time? And I kind of culled it down to, acting responsibly. That is really a driver for the things that we do, and it can be the driver for what all of you who are going through the business school can do to be effective and influential and good business people of the future. The other thing that was mentioned, and Colin Tim brought this up in his talk, and he said that morality and ethics are concepts for a full stomach. And I thought about that a lot, because how do you not have a full stomach? Well, you have a job, you earn money, you can buy food, you can have a place to live, you have a kitchen. And that led to the point of how do you get jobs? And that came to me as an employee of the Adidas Group and what I've been doing. I would describe myself as a business person. I'm a business person working for a $16 billion corporation. I'm an executive working for a $16 billion corporation. I've been there for almost 20 years. I'm an advocate. I'm an advocate of workers' rights. We have a supply chain, independent supply chain of 2,000 factories. And that number is a lot higher if we consider tier 2s, raw material suppliers, or embellishers. That number is probably closer to 3,000. So I'm an advocate for workers' rights. I'm also an activist, and I'm an activist for fair, healthy, and safe working conditions in those 3,000 factories. And I'm an activist for responsible buying practices and the way that I can contribute in my role as an employee of the Adidas Group and how we are buyers of product throughout the world. So those were my reflections this morning, and that was only 1 cup of coffee. But I've been with Adidas for almost 20 years. We have a supply chain of 2,000 factories. We have 43,000 employees. We do business in over 100 countries throughout the world. You heard the brands that we own. I worked with Adidas before we owned many of those brands. We have almost 800,000 people working in those 2,000 factories making our products. It's an extraordinary number of workers to have, to be responsible for, even though we do not directly employ those people. We contract factories to make our products. So it's a little bit different than the 43,000 people who are direct employees of the Adidas Group, but the principles are really not any different. I'm a founder and a leader of the Social and Environmental Affairs Department. We're a corporate services department. We work with all of the brands in the group, all of the licensees, subsidiaries, and other business entities attached to the Adidas Group. The Social and Environmental Affairs team started in 1997. It was birthed, if you will, from the middle of the 1990s, when our brand, along with several other brands, were directly impacted by allegations and actual verification of child labor in the factories making our soccer balls in Pakistan. And in 1996, we developed our first code of conduct for the corporation, and we started our team in 1997. We're 63 people. And I'd like you to remember that number. We're 63 people. It sounds like a lot, but there are 2,000 factories out there. Those 2,000 factories are in 69 countries. My team here in the Americas, we cover 17 countries. A little bit of a flavor about our team. We're manufacturing and sourcing experienced persons like myself. We have labor lawyers. We have environmentalists, we have advocacy people that are on our team, people that came from NGOs in the advocacy world, quality control inspectors. We have a variety of experiences that offer the diversity to our program to really understand the issues and the root cause of the issues from the ground level. Our team last year did 1,450 visits to our supply chain. And that wasn't 1,450 factories, different factories. Some of those factories on those visits, they were visited 4 or 5 times during the course of the year. And we have a risk model that we use, a profile, to determine with what frequency we go to visit our factories. So for instance, a factory in Montreal or in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, we're touching base with the people at those factories, but we haven't been there in a long time. Yet I can name a dozen factories in El Salvador where I've actually been to 2 of them 3 times in the last 4 months. So, you know, that 1,450 factory visits by 63 people is really dealing with the issues on workers' rights, on health and safety, and on environmental issues. Our team also did 200 individual capacity building or training exercises last year. And that's where we might offer training, again, really predicated on the profile of a factory need or a workforce need, fundamental workers' rights. Or it might be a more advanced training session around occupational health and safety officer training, or it might be, training of management for human resource management systems and proper policies for discrimination or for freedom of movement or freedom of association. And then basically our job as we go through every day is to focus on improving working conditions in that supply chain, reduce our environmental footprint and the footprint of our suppliers, to act responsibly as a multinational, and to engage stakeholders, the local stakeholders who can help us better understand those conditions where we are making our products. And I would also say that we're not desk drivers. The 63 of us are in the field. We're in the factories. We live in, I'm an exception, but we live in the areas where we are producing our products. Although my wife might disagree with that. I'm gone so often, she probably thinks I do live somewhere else. The apparel industry, having worked in the apparel industry since 1978, I feel confident in saying the apparel industry is a low-wage, low-skill industry. And maybe more importantly, it has been a driver of modernization and growth in emerging economies. And even if we look back to the 1850s, where apparel manufacturing and textile manufacturing was centered in Europe, and then it started migrating to the United States. And why was that? Because many of the raw materials, like cotton, were here in the United States, and it was a matter of bringing your manufacturing closer to your raw material sources. And then when you look at the 1970s, when the industry started moving to Central America and to Latin America and to Mexico, and then when you looked at that migration that was happening almost simultaneously to Asia, the apparel industry and textile industry has served as a driver of economic development in emerging economies. That has brought about a whole series of difficulties and challenges in trying to ensure there are fair, healthy, and safe working conditions in those factories. Our top 5 production countries, and this is out of 69 countries where we manufacture, our top 5 countries for production are China, India, Turkey, Vietnam, and Thailand. The issues that we continue to confront, and I'm sure that in 1910 I had a predecessor somewhere in the world, and most likely in the United States, doing the same thing that I'm doing, trying to ensure there were fair, healthy, and safe working conditions. But the same things are still being confronted. Issues of how employers handle the employment relationship, issues of working hours, issues of discrimination, and issues around freedom of association, issues around wages. What's a fair wage? What's a living wage? What's a minimum wage? And how do you accommodate all of that? Some of the things that we do in trying to evaluate the performance in our supply chain is, 3-tiered, if you will, and we've moved over the years from a checklist policing type of monitoring system, which was our first generation, in which I was an architect of our first monitoring tool back in 1997. We moved from that to looking into the root cause analysis of why these problems were occurring. And most recently, we're moving towards the development of management systems. We've identified what the root causes are. So, what are the gaps in human resource management systems, or health and safety management systems, or environmental management systems? And for those of us fortunate enough to live in the United States, North America, or Europe, those seem like pretty straightforward things. But when you look at Latin America and when you look at Asia Pacific, a human resource management system is not a well-defined concept. I can remember walking into factories and saying, "May I speak with your human resource manager?" And they brought me to an office and the sign on the door was payroll. And that was kind of the extent of human resource management system. So a lot of our work has really been maturing and driving to the development and the implementation of management systems in the contracted facilities making our products. So our monitoring system now revolves around 3 steps. One is a threshold and zero tolerance audit scheme, which is for entry level of factories coming into our supply chain, and we make sure that a series of 9 threshold issues and 4 zero tolerance issues are achieved, and that those are not breached. If they are breached, the factory does not enter our supply chain. We then move over time to a performance auditing of that factory, which starts analyzing what the gaps are in their management system. And then our sustainability monitoring system and assessments are really driven towards self-governance and the implementation of self-governance in these factories, managing their own management systems. Human resource management system, ISO 14001, OSHA's 18001, those are common certifications that we've seen coming in our supply chain. And just to take 2 of them, ISO 14001 and OSHA's 18001, 60% of our footwear manufacturing suppliers for all of the brands have now implemented one and the other. ISO 14001 and OSHA's 18001. So we're building the culture of management systems in our supply chain. We have a long way to go, and there's still a lot of unanswered questions, but these are metrics of progress. We do measure the performance of our factories. We have a key performance indicator. There are 6 units of measure. We publicly report on the performance in our supply chain. The metrics in our supply chain guides the way we work with those factories. And it also helps us profile the factories. So we have a series of factories that are in risk management clusters, where we are doing more policing work, where we are doing more, if you would call it a harsh approach, a clear-cut approach of good or bad. We then have a partnership model, which is for our acceptably performing factories, and that's where we collaborate with other brands, other MSIs, multi-stakeholder initiatives, local organizations to try and improve, continuous improvement of the working conditions in those factories. And for those of you who might be wondering, yes, Adidas Group and Nike, there are some competitors, but I can tell you that in my side of the work, we collaborate quite closely with the folks at Nike, and we share more factories than any other 2 athletic brands, and as a result, we work quite closely on this partnership model with our supply chain so that there's the leverage of one messaging, one communication, one expectation for that factory owner from multiple brands. And then the final cluster, and this is a very small cluster, it's less than 10% of our supply chain. Those are the self-governance factories. And those are the ones who have the management system certifications, who've proven and been measured in their performance to show that they can effectively manage their employment relationship, their health and safety responsibilities, and reduce their environmental footprint. So I'm going to stop. I think I've exceeded my 10 minutes, but I'd like to give my colleague Bonnie a chance to speak.
Thanks, Greg. Bonnie.
Okay, whoop. Oh, come on. My light's green. Am I on? Yeah. Good. Okay, I actually have a poem I'd like to start with. Good morning. Nice to be here. And Microsoft. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in my dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do while the earth was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing. As the mammals, reptiles, and birds were all dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew? I'm riding home on the Como train. I've got the voice of the Milky Way in my dreams. I have teams of scientists feeding me data daily and pleading I immediately turn it into poetry. I want just this consciousness reached by people in range of secret frequencies contained in my speech. I am the desirous earth, equidistant to the underworld and the flesh of the stars. I am everything already lost. The moment the universe turns transparent and all the light shoots through the cosmos, I use words to instigate silence. I'm a hieroglyphic stairway in a buried Mayan city, suddenly exposed by a hurricane, a satellite circling Earth, finding dinosaur bones in the Gobi Desert. I am telescopes that see back in time. I am the procession of the equinoxes, the magnetism of the spiraling sea. I'm riding home on the Colma train with the voice of the Milky Way in my dreams. I am myths where violets blossom from blood like dying and rising gods. I'm the boundary of time, soul encountering soul in tongues of fire. It's 3:23 in the morning and I can't sleep because my great-great-grandchildren ask me in my dreams, what did you do while the earth was unraveling? I want just this consciousness reached by people in range of secret frequencies contained in my speech. So that is one of my favorite poets in the world. His name is Drew Dellinger, and he's located in the Bay Area, and I'd highly recommend he has a little book and a video or a CD that you can buy of many of his poems. But I saw him recently, and I think that really is the ultimate question. I'm thrilled that Gregg was able to speak first because I'm not going to repeat a lot of the things that we at HP did. In fact, I have folks like Gregg and Nike in the apparel sector, like Levi Strauss and Gap, many of the companies who were attacked in 1996, to thank for the programs that we've built, because we very much walked on their backs. And even today, while we bring factories to the developing world, what we often find is that we move into many of the factories that they've already built or the workforces that they've already built. So in some cases, we at the electronics sector are a little bit higher on the food chain, and we can take advantage of trained people and don't have the proliferance of child labor and things like that in our workforce. And I think one of the challenges that we face is to really see the interdependence that's been talked about here, and for folks like Gregg and I to get together, the electronic sector and the apparel sector to get together, and when it's time for them to leave and go globalize somewhere else and move to places like Bangladesh and Lesotho, and where there's war happening every day, and they're bringing jobs and a better quality of life. It's for when they're about to leave places, can we come in and help make sure that the quality of life is maintained? And so I think there's a tremendous interdependence. I thought what I would do is just talk a little bit about some of the tenets, the principles that I've lived by in my career, and just give you a couple of examples. One is that I think it's really important that, as we move through this space, and I loved the quote that you gave earlier about business and the fact that we have such an impact on the planet. I found that early on in my career as I traveled throughout the world and arrived at places like Papua New Guinea or Africa or the Middle East, and I'll never forget when I arrived on one island in Papua New Guinea, and the whole island was clear-cut, and I met with 35 of the elders, and I said, how did this happen? And they said, well, we all got $2, by some timber company. And I saw this time and time again, and I said, if I'm going to have an impact in the world, I really need to go into the belly of the beast, into the mouth of the lion, and learn how to walk in those shoes, and learn how to speak that language, and do a good business case analysis, and demonstrate, how business can be good for everyone. So, but I really think it's important to be empathic through this process and walk in everyone's shoes. We're all people, and even corporations are a large collection of people. Do they become a system that at times gets corrupt? Okay. That at times becomes corrupt. For sure, it's a system, and that's what happens, you know, in many cases with systems. When I started my environmental career when I was at Penn State, and the events that are happening in Japan most recently are really touching me and affecting me pretty deeply, because I was a representative of student government at the time, and during 3 Mile Island, which was the radiation leak that happened there. And I came into the rooms, I was able to be part of the discussions with the power plant operators and the legislators. We called them NIMBYs, like you have NIMBYs, not in my backyard. There's NIMBYs, not in my election year. And so, you know, we were with the legislators, with the power plant operators, with the citizens that were scared, with the university faculty, and I was a representative of the student body. And I saw people, you know, screaming at the power plant operators or screaming at the legislators. And at one moment I looked over and at the power plant operator's face, and he just said, "How do you think I feel? I was in the plant that day and my family lives 3 blocks away." You know, and I thought, gosh, that's so true. And, you know, and we none of us really have total control over this. Should we have control? Yes. I mean, but the facts really are that it's all pretty complex, and we're sort of plundering our way through it and trying to figure it out together. And so it was early on I recognized that I actually was pre-law that I wanted to go into mediation and be part of the solution and help mediate conflicts and make sure that people were hearing each other. So I really think that walking in everyone's shoes and looking through many different lenses is an important thing, particularly as we go to factories, and we're in countries like China, and we may have these opinions that China is doing this or that, or the human rights are this, you know, but there are some amazing things. I've been going back and forth to China 4 times a year for the last decade or so, and there's a commitment to collectivism that we here in America and in the West can learn a lot from, and some incredible values. And so I think that we have so much to give one another. One of the other things I wanted to talk about was just, it's how you do it. It's not necessarily what you accomplish. It's very important. I am a person, and when you probably read some of the articles, or if you decide to read some of the articles about me, they say, she gets things done, you know, she makes things happen, and that's absolutely true. But I focus a lot on the how. And there's actually a good book that's called that, How. I forget who the writer was, but he was the owner of LRN, an ethics company in the South. And you know, when we were going into factories and being attacked by some of the groups, there was one group, Greg's probably familiar with them, called SACOM, Students and Scholars Against Corporate Misbehavior. And you could tell just in the name, it was like, oh, this is going to be a fun conversation. And what I did right away was, you know, they were attacking us and saying this was happening, and there was no, you know, safety in a couple of the factories, and we're very concerned about those things. We do the same type of thing, the auditing and the training and questionnaires and contract mechanisms and reporting and lots of training. I mean, ultimately it comes down to us making investments in our partners and understanding that that's always been part of the system. I mean, when we were doing quality back in the 70s, 80s, I mean, we knew that we had to go into the factories and train them on these things. So why is it different now that we're at sustainability? And they're our partners. And we couldn't just walk out of the factories. A lot of money was put into the equipment, and a lot of capital investment. So it wasn't appropriate to just extract ourselves. And one of the things I saw early on as a result of the impacts and allegations from NGOs against companies were they were measuring their progress by how many terminations they had. And I think Gregg probably remembers this. I watched a lot of those reports back in 98, 99, 2000, and it was like we had 430 factories, and this year we terminated 237. And I was jarred or jolted by that and said, is that really an accomplishment? I was like, that seems like you've spent all this money and all this time developing these partners, speccing these products, sourcing, transporting to and from them, and now we're just terminating them because you found an incidence of child labor, or you found working hours to be excessive, or wages to be low, or health and safety issues. A lot of the times, one of the things you often see is you see equipment that's shut down, or where the locks and guards are shut off. And that's often done to meet quota. Some of the people in the factory say, well, if they make me wait too long in between the next thing I have to do, so I turn them off. But unfortunately, they also can take off fingers and hands and arms and things. And so we're really looking at things like that when we're in the factories and inspecting. And inspecting, I don't like to use that word very much, and I even shied away recently of auditing, because it's not about policing. It really is about helping them see that by doing these things, they can be more productive, produce higher quality, have higher morale in the workforce, less absenteeism, less injuries and accidents, less insurance premiums, and ultimately less turnover. I mean, the thing that really hits our companies, and when I started my program, my VP said, we're seeing 70% turnover in some places. If you can help us, great. You're worth your weight in gold. So it's really the how you do it, and what we did with SACOM was we just invited them in. He said, you can attack us from the sidelines, but I mean, I think you do get access to some of the voices in here in a better way than we do. So why don't you come on in? Let's have you interview all the workers and help us design the trainings. We think you're right about some of these allegations. We think some of them you're not so familiar with because you haven't been inside. And they were shocked. They were like, you're actually going to let us in after years and years of brands fighting? I said, yeah, I mean, we need help. This is complicated. Come on in. So it's really the how. Another point I wanted to make was make yourself dispensable. And when I worked on the Boston Harbor Cleanup Project, it was one of my first projects in the environmental field. I remember that the gentleman who hired me, he worked pretty hard to get me out of I was doing lobbying and private sector work into the public sector. I worked for the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. And when the first day I walked into work, I sat down and he said, I have one job for you and one job only. And I was like, a bit jarred because he was really nice until that moment. And I thought, what would that be? And he said, make yourself dispensable. And I remembered initially, I was like, I thought I was special, And I said, I don't understand that. I mean, didn't you work hard to find me? And really soon I found out what that meant. And it really means to look at the processes, the tools, the templates, the systems, and the teams, and build them all up and provide them with ways to see things and ways to share information so that you can walk out and the system is sustainable. That's really the true definition of sustainability. And so I learned that early on, and that's why Gregg talked a lot about root cause analysis and management systems. We came into our program thinking about that. So make yourself dispensable. I think also speaking in lots of languages is really important, diversity. And I would just really add there that for me, it's been great to learn. I was an activist at the Penn State level, then I was working for the state government, then I owned my own consultancy. Now I've spent 13 years inside a large corporation, and now I'm going to go work for the university as the executive director on this large consortium with many companies. And so it's allowed me to look through many different lenses, but most importantly to learn the different speak. And so to have learned CIO, CFO, CEO speak has been incredibly valuable, because I know what I'm really trying to accomplish. But if I can talk in the language of here's the return on our investment, and here's what our competition is doing and how we benchmarked it, and here's how we can get to market quicker, and here's how we can improve the quality, I'm going to get a lot more attention. And so I'll just end with, I really think this is ultimately about service, and and really about the value of values. And it's thrilling to me to see as many universities, and in particular faith-based universities, really getting involved in this space. It's an incredible partnership that I think in many ways has existed since the beginning of time, but hasn't been emphasized enough in the last 4 or 5 decades, when we've developed at a pace and at a rate that is incredibly unsustainable. You know, we're about to destroy the wonderful Garden of Eden that we've been given. And I think it's really important that we play together in this space, and that we serve together and recognize the value of values, and you know, again, at the seat of all of these corporations, and for people like us, we're people, and we're starting to see a lot of the executives, the CEO level people, coming from the 60s and having children and recognizing it's time to think about their future. So I believe this is a very exciting time. So with that, I'll end.
All right, we'll turn it open to questions here in a couple minutes, but I want to just kind of focus. Wonderful overviews, interesting stories about your personal developments, but also about your industries. To bring this really to the theme of the conference here, one of the questions, a figure that's consistently quoted as a key reference point for the issues of global poverty is that 3 to 4 billion people live on less than $2 a day. How are large company supply chains making a difference in changing this current reality?
Well, I think I would come back to the history of textile and apparel manufacturing and development. It's been an economic driver in emerging economies. It's been a driver in changing economies from agrarian societies to more industrialized societies. So at least from a corporation that I work for, which, you know, markets and distributes and sells footwear and apparel and textiles and golf equipment, that would be how we do that. We're outsourcing our supply chain. We're working with developing countries. We're indirectly employing people making those products. So that's how we're contributing.
I think that there are 270 million children in labor today, and most of them are living in those families that are making below $2 a day, and we all have, you know, often tremendous perspectives or criticism about many of those children in labor, but the facts are that if they weren't, there would not likely be food on the table for many of those families. And so what the job is for people like us working in corporations to make sure that if they are in labor, or if, you know, we're going into a country where the minimum wage is quite a bit lower than it is here, that we also make sure that they're getting education, and we also make sure that they're getting opportunities to improve their quality of life. And so I think that, you know, I've often heard and particularly as the economy is going through a tough time, you know, you're just taking away American jobs and, you know, and moving all the manufacturing out and things like that. And quite honestly, I'm a real believer in globalization. I've been all over the world, and I think it's time for us to share. And I think it's a time for much of the world to even begin to taste some of the quality of life that we've had. Can we do it in a smarter way? Yes, and I think it's really our responsibility, our obligation, to be bringing clean technologies and to be looking at the systems there to help improve them, and not simply relying on the government to do that.
Can I have 2 follow-up points on examples? I was trying to think of, okay, where was poverty alleviated? And I'll take Costa Rica as an example. And the apparel industry in Costa Rica was a huge industry in the 1960s and 70s. And it started fading out in the 1980s. And why was that? Because the workers in those factories were retiring. They had been making money, and that enabled them to send their kids to school. Those kids were educated and did not want to go to work in an underwear factory or in, you know, a basic apparel commodity item factory. And the service industry became a major employer in Costa Rica. So that's one example where this industry that I work in has caused that change. A second might be, and it's occurring now, and when we look at Southeast China, Guangzhou, Guangdong, that whole area, Shenzhen, that had been the manufacturing industrial powerhouse of China. And it still is in many ways. But industry is also migrating from there to the interior. Several reasons. One is that wages have gone up. Two is that the wages being earned by those factory workers is paying for education for their kids. And there are fewer and fewer workers that want to go to work in those apparel factories or footwear factories. They do want to go work in an HP factory, but even that's becoming something that is not as desirable, but still a step up. So I offer Costa Rica and Southeast China as an opportunity to consider where these economic drivers of the apparel and textile industry has addressed poverty and has enabled education, which in my opinion is one of the key breakers of the paradigm of poverty.
All right, the last question from me before we get to you, so start thinking of your questions. So what about one of the most important links in the supply chain? What about the customers? Because after all, the customers, get my question right here. The customers are the ones generating the demand for all the activity that occurs throughout the global supply chain. What is the customer's role in creating a supply chain that's responsible and having a positive impact on reducing global poverty?
It's not as effective as it should be. That would be my straightforward answer, and this is coming from somebody who regularly sits in front of critical advocacy groups or stakeholders that do not like the way we do business. But the reality is the consumer is not putting enough pressure on. And I wonder if that's really, you know, an effect of our economic crisis in North America. And maybe there is going to be a shift in that consumer awareness or concern. I'm not sure. But I've always felt that there is not enough consumer activism. There is activism, but people do not, in fact, back up their feelings and their emotions with their wallet. And, you know, I don't know if there are any ways to measure that. But there are ways to look at companies and to evaluate. Consumers do have access to evaluations of how companies perform in their corporate responsibility. There are economic and socially responsible indicators. The Dow Jones Sustainability Index, FTSE for Good. We've been ranked, our company has been ranked on those financial indicators for almost 12 years, so as have many other companies. So that's one way that consumers can get the information. Another way is annual reporting. A friend from Microsoft mentioned to me this morning that she said, I just saw your new annual report. And yeah, for 11 years, the Adidas group has been reporting on our social and environmental affairs, our corporate responsibility activities in the supply chain. There are many companies that are doing that, maybe not enough. But there are ways for consumers to look at the performance of the brands or the makers or the suppliers of those products that they use every day, and they can make a value judgment, but it's way under. The consumer impact has been much less than it could be.
I think that we are also responsible for not providing that information in a simple, easy, and convenient way. And it's become evident to me that consumers, before they buy things, are not going to sit down and read an annual report. And the truth is about 80% of the Fortune 500 and even the Fortune 1000 now are reporting on sustainability. Challenge is that the reports are often not very comparable to one another. You know, we've been given indicators. There's something called the Global Reporting Index, which gives you indicators, but they're really a company can cherry pick and say, oh, I don't think I'll report on freedom of association because we're in America and that's not really relevant. You sit there and go, well, I don't think that's true for most of the rest of the world, and we are, you know, we are in situations where workers really do need to be represented in some way. So I think that we all have a responsibility as the corporate sector and then the governmental sector, as well as the investment communities. And you see socially responsible investment entities that have been cropping up, but not really enough of them and not powerful enough in the marketplace to put pressure. But more recently, you've started to see some of the mainstream, and you've got Fortune and has a large conference, and everybody's got the buzz, and there are big conferences about sustainability and green, and so it's much more of a conversation. I just want to say that in the consumer space, what we typically find across the board is that about 10 to 20% of the market, and even less than 10 depending on what the product is, are what we call socially responsible consumers, care about what they buy and will go out of their way and look at how is this made, is it organic, is it healthy? They'll look at things like that. And then you've got another sort of 10 to 20% on the other extreme that could care less. I mean, don't, even bother me with that information. I just want what I want. And so you've got this whole middle sector that, has yet really to be decided, and for the most part makes their choices first and foremost on like design and, that thing that I want that I have to have. And then the second is cost. And usually cost can be higher for a lot of people as well. I mean, obviously Walmart does really well in the bad economic times because they're saving everyday low prices. And so that we're really looking at, what is that market in between and how do they make choices? And one of the things we found is there's a lot of discussion of what they call in me, on me, and around me. And they typically, or you all as consumers, will typically make more conscientious choices when you're going to put something in your body. You're going to eat it, you're going to digest it in some way, taking medicine, things like that. So that you're more concerned about. And we've seen a very sharp increase in the marketplace. Now, is the Whole Foods as big or have as much market share as a Safeway or many of the other major markets? No, but it can't be ignored because the increase has been really dramatic. In the last 5 years, I mean, the graphs show that their growth rates have been astronomical. So you do see the Safeways and the different companies going, we need to pay attention, we need to change things on our shelves, change our look. So that in me is a big thing, on me as well. And so that's where things like Gregg's products, people care a little bit more about that. They'll tend to look at apparel and things and go, how was this made? Was it made responsibly? Is it organic? So we're seeing more growth in that space. And on me could even be your headsets, things like that. And then the around me is your furniture, your car, your computer, those types of things. And so that's lagging, and people are not making as conscious choices about that. But I do think that these indexes are increasing. There's a demand, and we've got one called the Good Guide down in the Bay Area that started, and that has, you can walk in and it has a little Apple application and you can scan the barcode and it'll tell you, and they've started with personal care products and they're moving to other things, and it'll be able to tell you what toxics are in there and who might have a better product. We'll probably see more things like that cropping up. The index and that I'm going to be a part of, be the executive director for, that question was probably almost designed for me. That's precisely what this is about. And when I thought about my career over the last 3 decades or so, I said, what do I want to do next? And I want to have that scale impact. I'm ready for scale. And I said, so this was a really exciting opportunity, and what's most exciting about it is it's about the consumer. It's doing a deep product life cycle analysis from the raw materials all the way to the shelves, so that that the companies, the retailers, because they're the ones demanding this, they're starting to say, look, people are asking for different things on our shelves. So we need to decide who gets shelf space and who doesn't. And so that's why there's 60 companies now involved. And in Gregg's, in the coalition around apparel, and there are 30 companies in that. And it's only going to grow because these companies are paying attention to the Walmarts of the world and the Carrefours and the Tesco's and the Costco's and the, because they are going to start making choices and deciding preference on who gets on their shelves based on some of these things. And so we're pulling them all together to look in detail at what would an index look like and how do we make that consumer friendly. So.
It's a lot of information that we need, but all right, opening it up for questions. So who have we got? We got some people in line here, so please jump in. Tell us your name and then ask your question.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Kunle Oguneye, president of an organization called TAN. Thank you to SPU, the people who put this together. I have a couple of comments. Hopefully they will raise questions. There's something missing at this discussion. Not just something, there are a lot of things, a lot of people missing. And so I throw this to John and to the organizers. Where are the Vietnamese people? Where are the Ethiopians? Where are the Somalis? Where are the people who are the bottom billions? You know, it looks like colonization 2.0. You know, a bunch of white people telling us how we're going to solve the world's problems. It's not an indictment. I want you to think about it, okay? So next time, hopefully we have this conference, we see a mix of people who've experienced this. I want to reiterate some of the comments that Bonnie and Gregg have made. For the younger students who are going out into the world, it's very nuanced. It's not black and white. They talked about child labor, and the press demonizes child labor. But they're very right in what they say. Without child labor, the society will not develop. So don't just go and say, oh, because you see children working, this is bad, we've got to close this factory. That's not the case. And I also want to encourage the students to think macro, not microfinance, but macrofinance. Business is what is going to drive economic growth and development. There are factories that can be built all over the world. Before Adidas, we wore shoes in Africa. True. So why can't we have more factories that are building shoes? How do you direct finance to businesses in the rest of the world? You know, the finance is directed from New York or London, and then they tell us, no, it can't go to Africa, there's risk, but they're willing to invest in mortgage-backed securities that will lose trillions of dollars. So, no, seriously, young people, I want you to think, please, differently about the world, and how do you drive those inputs into emerging economies.
Can I make one comment to that? You know, there is something called the Pachamama Alliance, which is interesting. It's in South America, and there's a campaign, and I would highly recommend you to make a note of it. It's called 4 Years Go. You can just go 4yearsgo.com. There's great videos on there. But it was this couple that went down to South America, and when they got together with the tribe, and they were appalled by some of the conditions that they saw. And like myself, I mentioned, I saw timber and different things mining around the world. And I've been to 90 countries, so I've seen quite a bit of things. What the tribe said to them was, look, if you're coming here to save us, go home. But if you realize or believe that your survival and your ability to thrive is directly interdependent and connected to ours, then you can stay. And we can work together. So I do believe that we need to listen to the rest of the world and include them. And yet at the same time, I do also believe that we in the Western nations are consuming the most and polluting the most on the planet. I mean, the numbers are staggering. And we're not providing the technologies as fast as we need to the remainder of the world. And so I think we do need to listen a lot and get out there. And like Gregg said, we never, those of us who are smart and have done this a while, we do not do our programs from our headquarters. We're out there in the field, in the factories, with the people.
Over there.
My name's Steve. I work in Africa, so my question's about Africa also. Understanding that dynamics from Asia are completely different than Africa, but what has happened in Asia has been really good to alleviate poverty. What do you think it's going to take to get corporations to start working in Africa? And I want to put the caveat of what happened in Africa with cell phones. They leapfrogged from no phones to cell phones. Now that wasn't an accident. Why can't business do that in Africa?
You know, I think, first of all, we do produce in Africa. We do manufacture there. The interesting thing is that we manufacture in Northern Africa because it's closer to raw material supply chains which are in Europe. And we also produce in South Africa, which has a source of raw materials. So I think that for the apparel and textile industry, and going to your point on the development of cell phone technology and coverage, is apparel and textile the right industry to help Africa emerge as economies? I don't know. But I would come back to, from the technical aspect of the business that I work in, raw materials supply is an issue. So in today's society where inventories need to be kept low, where consumer demand can vary minute to minute, where you're trying to buy closer to delivery and stocking on the shelves, to have a raw material supply chain that may take up 60 or 80% of the time between your order and your delivery, with manufacturing actually not taking that much time, that doesn't fit a business model. So raw material supply, in my opinion, is an issue in Africa. And in the northern part, okay, it's covered out of Europe. In the southern part, it's local. But for the central part of Africa, that raw material supply chain is going to be very long or immature or endangered somehow. But it won't make a good business case.
I want to make, I think, 3 points about Africa. One is, we too are also in Africa, or the electronic sector is in Africa, and it's actually gotten quite a bit press in the last year or two, because in rechargeable batteries, which are in your cell phones and your laptops, and also in the hybrid cars as well, inside that is a material called coltan, comes from tantalum, that's mined largely in the Congo region, and incredibly complicated. The DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, you know, very unstable environment, unstable government, unstable society, and so being in there has been a real challenge, and being able to get to the places and figure out how to make sure that it's the mining is being done safely, that women and children are, and people are not being threatened and hurt and even killed as a result of the activities. And so these are incredibly complex situations, and largely what I think, you know, companies, when corporations ask themselves, where should we go, they look at risk indices, and quite honestly, it's not going to be their first choice to go into a place that's so unstable. You know, from the government, they actually look for governments who say, here are these tax advantages, here's, you know, opportunities we're going to provide you, here's a workforce that's stable and that's not being, you know, threatened with machine guns. And so it's, that's one of the more complicated issues, and it continues throughout a lot of Africa. I think, I shouldn't say a lot, but certainly many regions in Africa. The other real issue, if you look at, I was involved in this group called Business Leaders in Human Rights, and I worked with ABB and Ericsson, and they had operation in the Sudan. And at one point, legislation came out here in the United States that said any companies, corporations who have business in the Sudan will not be able to sell their goods here. You will be legislated out of the process. I mean, this is really a horrible thing. It's much the same as what I was talking about in the cut and run with the factories. I mean, when we just walk away from societies like this, you know, we're abandoning them. We're abandoning the people that really need help. I mean, communications technology is one of the things that really provides education, access to information. If you look at China, in the last decade, so many of the protests, so much of the activity has occurred there because they have cell phones, they have internet, they have a way to communicate, a way to organize. And here we were bringing it in, and yet the government, our own U.S. government, was saying stay out. Now, boycotts are appropriate at different times, but we have to be intelligent about that. My final point on Africa, which is also really complex, is there is a lot of business there today, and it's large. A lot of it is China. China is developing very, very rapidly in Africa. Are they doing it well? And is the world community is extremely concerned about the rate at which they're developing, the way they're developing, the leaders that they're supporting, the natural resources they're exploiting. So, you know, the real question we have to ask ourselves is, you know, are we there for the right reasons? And are we there to really help advance those societies? And I think the world community needs to have an opinion on that. And if you haven't read, there's a really great book from Jared Diamond called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it really talks about how the whole Southern Hemisphere has developed. And I would highly recommend it because it helps us think about how come, you know, there's this band around the whole, you know, the whole planet that, you know, has developed so much quicker than the southern part of the more arid regions, continents. And so we, again, have a response.
Yeah, great. Next question here.
Hi, my name is Mar Smith, and I wanted to ask you your opinion of the California Transparency in the Supply Chain Act, which is, I'm sure you're aware of, was signed into law in 2010 to be implemented in 2012 in order to legislate that companies over a certain size need to add policies dealing with transparency, training, and monitoring of supply chain, especially in the area of human trafficking and labor. So I wanted to hear your opinion as, about this and about this approach of legislating some level of transparency. What are the strengths and weaknesses of doing that?
I think both, probably, Greg, and I would say that we're complete fans and proponents of transparency. Transparency is leadership. Transparency allows us to work together. Quite honestly, a lot of this is not rocket science. I mean, when we show up at factories, the factory themselves has a sign on the wall that says all of their customers, you know, that when they obtain us as customers, they put out press releases and let you know about it. There's certainly challenges inside a large corporation to release a supplier list and the information and the violations and the things about what's happening because we're such a litigious society. And people are always there on the sidelines going, you know, we need to sue you because you knew about this and you didn't do anything about it. You know, and it's not that we're not doing anything about it. It's that so I believe that I was one of the first electronics. We were one of the first electronics companies to release our entire supplier list, and then have a lot of details on all our reports on every compliance violation, and so does Adidas and all of the footwear and apparel, and not all of them, but the leaders. And I think that all the leading companies, the largest companies, are generally proponents of this because the problems are in the other 70% that you don't hear about. Yeah. That's the part of the market that we're having a really hard time bringing up. So we're proponents of it.
I would just add in that when I learned about this last October, there was not a concern in the least about the requirements. The most difficult thing we face is how to make all of the appropriate linkages to the requisite statement we have to put on our website. So it's an IT functionality of pulling together, you know, this annual report and the supplier disclosure that we've been doing for 9 years, and making sure that the information that is already on, that we're already publicly reporting, whether it's our code of conduct, the verification from the Fair Labor Association on the effectiveness of our program, our public, that all has to be tied together and linked to this statement. That's the hardest thing.